This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Alright, this is Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast produced by Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu, with the support of New Zealand On Air, so cheers for that, guys. Today I'm talking to Kane Power. How's it going, Kane?
Yeah, very good. Kia ora, Hugh.
Excellent. Glad to hear it, and also good to see that your level is behaving itself on the VU meters, which I should have checked before I hit record, but I did not. So we met at the very first podcasting summit, and I subsequently bothered you to come on this show, and the thing that you wanted to talk about was hardcore, the music genre, which is interesting because, if I'm remembering your emails right, you actually studied hardcore, and this is probably the first time I've had a conversation with someone who's like academically studied the thing that they want to talk about.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I mean, I grew up in the hardcore scene in Hamilton, and spent many years in there. And then when I was doing my music degree, my late teens, early 20s, I stayed on for an honors year, and they sort of said, "Well, you have to, come up with something to talk about. You need a subject." And I racked my brains and realized that hardcore was probably the thing that I knew most about, or that I was most interested in. And so that's what I based my dissertation on for my honors year. So I did go into hardcore music production in great depth. So it was less about like the etymology and history of the scene, more about what hardcore sounds like in a recorded form. But that did involve a lot of research, yeah.
And also, I guess, if you're thinking about it from a production standpoint, like how you would achieve particular things, like how do we make something sound this particular way? Yeah,
exactly that. That's exactly what we talked about. So it was going through and listening to tons and tons of records, and highlighting similarities between the production. And actually, it was really cool because I actually reached out to some of the original members of hardcore bands who had become recording engineers and studio owners and producers, throughout the decades, and that were still around producing modern hardcore records. I actually reached out to them and were able to talk to some of my idols in the hardcore scene about how they make records. So yeah.
That's a really cool experience to have.
It was.
Yeah. So I guess by way of laying some groundwork, I wasn't super, like I've heard the term and I'm familiar with some of the far more famous edge of figures, people like Henry Rollins, who basically everybody's heard of. But
Sure.
But I wasn't hugely familiar with what hardcore was until you sent me a couple of playlists to have a listen to. Like, how would you define it as a genre by way of starting off?
Well, I guess the original form of hardcore was defined. It was called hardcore punk, and it was kind of the embers of the punk movement were sort of dying out, and a new movement was coming through, and people were kind of a similar ethos, rejecting mainstream music, mainstream commercialism, and thriving from the punk scene, but a bit more aggressive, a bit more, playing a bit faster, a bit heavier, a bit more yelling and screaming, a bit more kind of, I guess just aggressive, really, than the standard sort of formula for what was the 70s peak era of punk. And I mean, it comes down to generally a 4-piece band, guitar, bass, drums, and vocals, and you've got hardcore.
It's interesting that vocals should be like a vocalist who doesn't do anything else, because that's not necessarily standard for punk. There are quite a lot of 3-piece punk bands where usually the vocalist tended to play guitar because that's easier than playing bass and singing. But having that 4-piece format's interesting. The thing I was going to say was that when I listened to the kind of early hardcore playlist that you sent through, the thing that struck me about it was how kind of how much about their feelings a lot of it was. Like there are lots of songs about like, I'm having a panic attack, which like that's interesting from the standpoint of like British punk being kind of what can we do that's going to piss somebody off. This is kind of a lot more sincere in some ways.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, why it is so appealing to so many people, because of that sincerity, that authenticity. It's everything on your sleeve, you know. And as you say, it is about the me, but it's more about looking at the world and observing how you feel about what's going on, and then really just putting that down as bluntly as possible. Yeah.
So how did that mutate and evolve into what it became then? Because you also gave me a kind of list of newer stuff to listen to. And the thing about that was it was a lot more, to my uneducated ear at least, like heavy metal. Like it was a lot more technical. There was a lot more kind of emphasis on like, look at this sick riff, bro. And the lyrical stuff seemed to be like, it's still aggressive and dealing with feelings, but it seemed to be a lot less vulnerable, if that's the right way of putting it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, it's just the same as anything else. Hardcore, you know, came and sort of evolved to be a middle ground between what we know as punk and what was metal, right? Taking elements from both and creating something new. And over the years, hardcore has morphed into infinite subgenres. So, you know, there are bands today that are being loyal to the original hardcore sound, and they might call themselves hardcore punk or straight up hardcore. And then there are bands that are taking it way more technical. You know, you might get a hardcore math or something like that. And then you might get just more to what you would have called metal even, you know, 10 years ago, but these days might technically come under the hardcore umbrella, because even just the fact that the members are from the hardcore scene or have played in other hardcore bands, or maybe that what they sing about is more of a hardcore thing, or it could even come down to guitar tone. You know, that's the sort of things that separate the different genres within the genre itself, and can really get as macro as you like.
I guess, I mean, that's something that might be a reservation if you were going to recommend that someone get into hardcore, is that it does strike me as one of those genres where people can get like endlessly hair splitty and needle sharpeny about exactly what this specific thing that we're doing is.
Yeah, and more so in the modern sense. Like, you know, if someone... I'll probably, you know, it's an appropriate podcast to talk about hardcore, because it's not really something that I would recommend. Generally, people that I discuss hardcore with have already been into hardcore, and, you know, we can talk about it. But if I was to recommend hardcore to somebody, it would just to go back to the start. You know, go back to the early 80s, really, and start listening to some of the seminal bands, and that's going to inform you on what it will become, but also just the general idea of it. It still holds true. You can listen to those bands now and, you know, still feel the same feelings. Whereas modern bands, yeah, splitting hairs, man. Yeah, there's so much variety. There's no real place to start except Terror. If you might as well just listen to Terror.
So, I mean, you say that you wouldn't recommend hardcore to someone unless they were kind of already, or you wouldn't really talk about it unless someone was already into it. How did you find your way in?
Yeah, well, teenage years, punk, listening to punk, skater punk, listening to those sorts of bands, and it was one. We used to get compilation CDs. Used to go to Defy and Hamilton or Tracks and go to the punk section, and you'd get the Warped Tour CD or whatever. And there was one called the California Takeover, and that had a whole lot of California hardcore bands on it. And so that was kind of my first entry into what hardcore was. And then, I was listening to a lot of metal, Slayer, Sepultura, and I would hang out with, people that listened to the same stuff. And then one day my mate's brother gave me a Sick of It All CD. And so I'd already kind of heard some hardcore bands, Strife, Snapcase. And then getting the Sick of It All CD actually gave me the chance to sit down and listen to a specific hardcore band, an entire album. And from that moment, really, there was nothing else that interested me from that point on. Punk was weak and just I don't know, it didn't have the same effect as soon as I kind of latched onto that as a teenager. You know what teenagers are like. As soon as you find your thing, you're just all about it, and nothing else can compare. Everything else sucks.
Yeah. I because of my era and the group of people that I moved with, that was simultaneously Radiohead and Nirvana and nothing else. And I had the kind of tape deck where you could get a cassette to play both sides and then both sides of another one, and there was a whole science to like queuing up sides of cassettes in the correct order and all this stuff.
Yeah, I'm there with you, man. I went through that as well. Something that's interesting now, I'm thinking about those early like California Takeover CDs and those compilations. It wasn't until years later when actually diving into hardcore and getting, actually becoming a fan of the genre, where I realized that a lot of the bands I'd already heard, like Descendants, would be a regular band that would be played on skate punk compilations. They're actually considered a hardcore band. And so there is, that kind of crossover within the scenes, that makes it accessible to a lot of people.
And I mean, talking about scenes, like there was a specific kind of geographical limit to where things were coming out of, at least to start with, right?
Yeah. I mean, the coasts of the United States, really. There's, California was really, I mean, we can, depends on who you talk to, but you could argue all day about where hardcore formed and how it formed and who formed it. Same as punk, same as anything. But it's generally agreed that Black Flag were at the forefront in the early days, and they were out of California. And then there were also scenes in Washington, and then later on, a couple of years later, New York. And really, those were the strongest scenes, the California and the sort of combined East Coast scenes. And it wasn't, there was that for a few years. And really, the Americans pioneered the sound and then took it to the UK and discovered that there were bands doing stuff like that, but haven't really called it hardcore and hadn't really formed such a scene that had happened in America. And it kind of snowballed from there. And now it's in every country.
The reason that I mentioned the kind of geographical limitation is that I was kind of curious about whether you thought that had formed the kind of the sonic character to start with, at least a bit. Thinking about kind of having had the chance to talk to people who are producing stuff, I did one of these episodes with a guy called Matt Sanko who drummed with a lot of there was kind of this explosion of like strange arty indie rock out of Palmerston North in the early 90s. And that has a really specific sound, which is because they were all using the same exact equipment. there was like one bass rig and one drum kit, and they all lent it to each other. And similarly, like the finger quotes Dunedin sound, a lot of that is because it was all recorded by like one guy in his living room with a 4-track machine, and so what you're listening to is one guy slowly learn how to use this 4-track properly. I wondered if there was any kind of contributing factor like that.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there are, and there is, and there was. Not quite as, the example is not quite as good as the Palmy example with one kit and one amp. America is huge, and these bands all lived so far apart. But in terms of ethos and kind of the sorts of people that were making this music, and the time that it was made, those influences all crept into the scene and really became a staple of the scene and of the sound of hardcore. And when the sound spread worldwide, although other bands took their own, locations and their own stylings and their own thoughts into creating their own music, it was definitely the template created by those earlier bands that most people adhered to. And so in terms of production, I guess there's not a specific sound. It can change from record to record. Hardcore is more about the style and the ethos behind the actual writing of the music and the performance of it, rather than the capturing of it.
Yeah, it's about the willingness to be kind of at 11 in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, totally.
So, I mean, talking about where it came from, do you have a sense of like the kind of cultural thing that it was a response to? That like there's a pretty clear, I mean, people could argue for hours about it, but there's a pretty clear sociological kind of like, this is where British punk came from. This is what was happening in the UK and that people were reacting to. Similarly with British metal and psychedelic rock and all that kind of stuff. Do you have a sense of where hardcore came from in that sense?
Well, I mean, yeah, kind of. It's very similar, anti-commercialism, anti-capitalism, anti-racism. For the most part, it's, there's the Reagan era in the States, so there's bands called Reagan Youth. It's basically saying fuck you to the establishment. It's a very, very similar thing to punk. But while a lot of punk stayed on that kind of vibe, hardcore changed and kind of morphed into different things. Nowadays, I mean, a lot of modern hardcore bands, the lyrical content would be more similar to hip hop, just boasting about what they do and what they have and where they go and what all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's less from the time and more from the people, and then that ethos is, I know I've said ethos 100 times already, but that's kind of all that hardcore is. It's an ethos, and you can go anywhere in any country, and everyone's got their own reason for creating this kind of music and for being angry. But that's really what it comes down to, is being dissatisfied with how things are, and expressing how that affects you and how it affects everyone around you, and perhaps, why you think it's shit. And, not often coming up with solutions.
No, that's like the entire political thesis delivered as a coherent action plan in the form of a 3-minute song is a very specific art form that not many people have mastered.
Yeah, exactly.
So I noticed a kind of moment of hesitation there, and I'm just going to poke it a little, which is that you said like mostly anti-racist, and I know that sure. In the UK the punks had this whole thing where they flirted with Nazi imagery as a way of provoking people. and then actual Nazis went, hey, that's neat, and then you ended up with Nazi punks. And I wondered if because, you know, high-speed rock and roll, while it's not exclusively, is often kind of a white field. And I wondered if that was a thing that hardcore had also run into difficulty with.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, look, there are dickheads anywhere, and there are dickheads in every scene. And hardcore is no different. In fact, you know, hardcore is a very aggressive, hyper masculine atmosphere, especially at shows, and it attracts certain type of people. And you know, also the styling especially of early hardcore, was a lot of skinheads, you know, Doc Marten boots, tight jeans, you know, kind of looking like punk, but, you know, you might call them skins. And that was also reflected in the kind of Nazi youth, you know, movement as well. A lot of those guys were wearing similar kind of style, and so those guys, some of those sort of racist characters, did eventually cotton on to the hardcore scene, start coming to shows, and there was a very clear division. And all it did really was, you know, hardcore is for everybody. Hardcore is inclusive. And I know I said it's hyper aggressive and masculine, but and that is 100% true, and it's still like that. But it is 100% inclusive at the same time. There's no room for racism in hardcore, just like there's no room for racism in punk rock. And so racists were, you know, commonly ostracized from the scene. Bands would write songs, anti-racism songs, you know, famously Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys wrote Nazi punks fuck off, in reaction to all of the racist dickheads showing up to the shows. But as I said, there are dickheads in every scene, and hardcore is no different, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the risk that you run, and as you mentioned, punk and metal has this problem as well, is that when your aesthetic is about like performative aggression, then people who want to be aggressive for all kinds of really unpleasant reasons also find that compelling.
Yeah, you know, it's definitely a part of it. It's definitely a part of hardcore. It's also a part of metal. You know, anywhere that you're confronted with major aggression and a safe space to kind of outlet that aggression, people are going to take advantage of that. And people who are into fighting almost couldn't find a better place to come to start a fight, because people are already wound up. People are already pushing each other around. All you got to do is push someone a little bit too hard, and you got a fight on your hands. And so, I mean, I remember in the early days in the Hamilton scene, it was occasionally a violent place. There would always be a fight or two at a show. Nothing too, you know, terrible, obviously, but violence is a big part of it, unfortunately. And I think these days, you know, generally we're a bit more cottoned on as a society, and maybe a bit less violent, or a bit less tolerant of violence. And, you know, whereas back in the day, maybe everyone was just like, whoa, this is a crazy thing, you know, just let it happen, or we can't really control it. These days, I think a lot of bands and promoters are a bit more outspoken that we won't tolerate violence. And so I can't really remember the last time I saw a fight at a hardcore show. That being said, it's not like I go to a lot of hardcore shows these days. So
I mean, I kind of have an interesting dot, or an interesting to me, I hope it's interesting to you, but a dot to join there, which is that I've had a couple of conversations with people about the tabletop role-playing scene, particularly in the like late 90s and early aughts, which was this point where there was this kind of explosion of games that were trying to get away from the dominance of Dungeons and Dragons and do new and interesting things. And one of the things that they wanted to do was like give people tools to tell stories with real emotional weight. I promise I am going somewhere with this. What that meant was that there was this culture for a while of like describing ghastly traumatic shit at the table because like we're supposed to be real and tell stories that are really powerful, and that wrecked some people. And as a consequence, if you look at games that come out of modern schools of game design, there are all of these safety tools and like ways of making sure that everyone is safe, and that if you're going to talk about horrific shit, that you do that within parameters that people can handle, and all of this stuff. And I wonder if, I mean, obviously a music performance to a crowd of hyped up people is a very different thing, but like it's interesting to see that increased level of like awareness of potential harm and like making sure that you manage stuff is something that kind of evolves through everything like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can think of, it's happened years ago. I remember when the change happened and bands would, start stopping. If there was a fight started, they'd just stop playing and be like, whoa, that guy, get him out. Or like, we won't tolerate this here. You fight, we stop, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, there's definitely, this is 20 years ago. So, it can only be a lot better now, surely.
Yeah, you would certainly hope so. Look, we are around about at the halfway point, so we're going to take a very quick break for some messages, and we will be right back after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And you're back. You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. And I'm talking to Kane Power about the hardcore scene. You mentioned that you kind of hadn't been to a hardcore show in a while, and I wondered if that was just like hyper-aggressive music as a young man's game, or if there was like more to it than that.
Yeah, I mean, both. Absolutely both. Firstly, when I was growing up in the hardcore scene, there was a hardcore scene. Hamilton was an absolutely thriving music scene for many, many different genres, hardcore included. And so there were shows every single weekend. There were bands. I played in bands. It was really, really cool. These days, there's not much of a hardcore scene to speak of. There are some of us older dudes and some other old bands that are getting back together, starting to revive it. And there are some really cool new bands as well. But there isn't a lot going on, really, especially in Hamilton. And I live in Raglan, but Hamilton's where I'm closest to. So, yeah. Honestly, Hamilton is, I think they doubled down on the family-driven agriculture approach to, a thriving city. And they have largely shunned the arts for the last couple of decades. It was at this amazing place years ago, 20 years ago. It was absolutely incredible. And then, in retrospect, at the time, I thought it was shit. Got to get out of Hamilton. But really, when that big group of people matured, you left uni, or you left high school, and then you did uni, and you left uni, and you sort of looked around at your opportunities, and you went, oh, fuck, well, there's nothing really here. I have to leave if I want to do anything that I want to do. So all the creatives eventually leave Hamilton. And that's just how Hamilton has been. And it feels like a couple of years after I left, and the generation behind me, was spent and went further afield to find their creative careers, then Hamilton just sort of dried up creatively. And I know, a lot of my friends are involved in trying to reinvigorate Hamilton in a creative sense and in an artistic sense. And there is real movement there, and people are doing amazing jobs, but it's still starting at scratch. And it's mostly from people who have gone away and come back, or have, had families and now finally have the time to start putting into it again, into the arts community. So it was, yeah.
No. That's. Yeah. I'm interested in it because It sort of mirrors my experience a bit, although I moved around between cities, so I'm not really comparing apples with apples. But certainly when I was a teenager in Dunedin, everyone was in a band and everyone's band had a gig, and the gig might be like, oh, I'm going to play at my mate's party. But there was, no matter what kind of a band you were in, and frankly, how shit you were, because some of the bands I was in were very shit. You could find somewhere to play, and that kind of came under a bit of a sustained attack in Dunedin for a while through things like people moving in next door to venues and then killing them with noise complaints, and that kind of stuff was a real problem for a while.
Yeah, totally. And look, we can complain about like the shutting down of venues and the lack of arts funding, the lack of community groups and safe spaces for all age shows. That stuff is all true and has all happened. But I also think that honestly, just stylistically, the younger generation who are motivated to get out there and actually create music and put on shows, they are not motivated to do it for hardcore punk, metal, rock, all of those older kind of genres. Kids just aren't into that stuff as much these days. Sure, there still are people that are into it, and young people at that, but majority of young people are just not, it's just not on their radar. They don't care about it. So why would they fight for venues and put on shows and start bands? They just don't need to.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that's a technological shift as well. One of the things that drove the creation of hip hop was that all of the music programs were pulled out of black high schools, and so no one had instruments. So the turntablism skill set was developed out of necessity. And these days, if you can pirate Fruity Loops, you can make the kinds of tracks that someone like Billie Eilish sings over in your bedroom by yourself. And so the need for a band is reduced in that way.
Yeah, and also getting acknowledgement and recognition and eyes and ears on your art is, I'm not saying it's easier, because actually, in fact, it's actually harder these days. You used to just be able to go, right, you'd ask for a show, you'd go down and you'd play to 50 people once a week, whatever gig was on. These days, you have to, although there is seemingly a lot more opportunity because you can just put it online and effectively millions of people can see it. That isn't really happening. But it seems like, why would I go through all of the hassle of starting a band, rehearsing and doing all of that stuff when I can just make it myself in my room how I want and then put it on Spotify myself and make a YouTube video and have a TikTok account to promote it.
So this is perhaps a difficult question, but like, does that matter? Like, does it matter if a particular style sort of fades in that way and kind of belongs to us old people? And you kind of only get old men playing to other old men. Like, is that okay, or is that something like, should there be outreach to try and interest people in this sort of stuff?
No. I mean, look, people can if they want. I'm not gonna outreach and try and get young kids into hardcore. Although, look, hardcore changed my life. It saved me in many ways, from, and helped me turn my life around. And it did that for many people, when same as metal and punk, when you find an outlet like that as a young person, it can really, provide a positive reinforcement for your trajectory. But look, hardcore will never die. Punk will never die. They're too big to die. There are still bands being formed every day that play that genre of music. There are still young people that are into it. It's just not as ubiquitous and as popular as it was. And I honestly couldn't care less. If there are cool bands making cool music that are coming out, then that's amazing. And I listen to modern hardcore and I love it. And there are some really, really amazing bands doing awesome things. But I'd quite happily listen to 80s and 90s hardcore for the rest of my days. I don't really, I'm not worried. And if it dies out, I don't think it will die. But if it does, then maybe it's just a period of time that will be noted in history.
Yeah, and I guess, I don't know if this is as true of hardcore as like a descriptor that gets put on things as it is of the descriptor hyphen punk, but like, because punk is such an attitude as opposed to necessarily a style, you can get like three guys banging on car parts and disused whiteware, and you can say that's punk because it embodies the attitude. You can get a band where the instrumentation looks like a bluegrass band, and you can say that's punk because that's the attitude and the approach that they're taking. And similarly with hardcore, I imagine, like, we're going to use the word ethos again, but you could bring that ethos to lots of different ways of making noises.
Yeah, and quite simply, it's very, very similar to punk. You know, hardcore does have a punk ethos. Essentially, it's essentially the same thing. I mean, yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly. You can apply it to anything you want. If you're just doing something to the extreme, and you know, living your best life and shouting in your voice, then fuck, it's hardcore.
Yeah. There's a point that I wanted to pick up a little bit, which is that you mentioned in the way past that it kind of used the word like saved you, and you mentioned that like other music does that for people, and sure, like finding the thing that's your thing is really powerful. But the other thing about hardcore that I want to touch on a little bit is that there does seem to be, and maybe this is just my perception, but there seems to be more of a vein of like people who have decided on the correct way to live and are taking that incredibly seriously as a component of the genre than necessarily in like grunge, for example. Like a lot of the lyrics don't make any sense. They're put there to fill the space that they needed phonemes for and kind of sonically fit the mood, and reading them for literal meaning is sometimes a mistake. But like hardcore is much more likely to give you a song about why like you should eat a particular kind of food only or something like that.
Yeah, it's true. It is totally true. And look, straight edge is a huge part of hardcore, and it always has been. You know, from the very early days. Minor Threat, one of the original hardcore bands, sing about straight edge. And yeah, you're right. I mean, look, and it can be a bit preachy, and like I tend to not really like those bands too much, you know. But a lot of people do, and in my own sense, I found bands that were saying, you know, no one can make you live the life you don't want to live. Believe in yourself, stand up for yourself, be the best yourself you can be, strive to be better, you know, respect those around you, you know, that kind of stuff. And that's what really spoke to me at a time that I needed it as a young man. That's something similar to a lot of people. And then I think a step further, if people, you know, maybe have a problem with alcohol and drugs, or have had a problem in their family with alcohol and drugs, then maybe they're going to latch on to someone who is singing about being straight edge and not doing those things and living a better life that way. And that can include people who believe in not eating animals or consuming any animal products, you know, that vegan straight edge is a thing. There are lots of, you know, there's Christian vegan straight edge, there's go as deep as you want. But you know, it's a similar thing to punk. You know, there are people out there like me, you know, and just finding a community of people that are like you and that you can identify with, I think is a strong feeling, especially for a teenager.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I guess I wasn't. I didn't intend that as a disparagement. Really, it was that strain of like focus on self-improvement in particular was a thing that I noticed, which like you don't. It's interesting because it's not necessarily an aesthetic component of a lot of other styles, even styles that people have really deep, powerful personal connections to.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, punk sings about fuck the government, metal sings about fuck the devil, and hardcore sings about believe in yourself. or fuck you, I don't know.
yeah, and look, there is something very attractive about that. A very winning about that kind of sincerity and willingness to have your heart on your sleeve. That is something that the world could probably use more of, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. Maybe just not in such a confrontational manner for most people, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, stuff with horses for courses. I mean, like, we talked about the confrontational stuff, but lots of music has confrontational elements. There's I was at the same time as I was listening to grunge and Radiohead, what everyone was listening to when they went out to clubs and outdoor raves was like insane aggressive drum and bass music, which is just completely unmotivated audio pain. No one is angry about anything. There's just a machine that's yelling at you for no reason. And
agree.
That was people's thing. They wanted as many typewriters to hurt them as they could have.
Yeah, totally.
So look, we are slowly approaching time. There are two things I like to do at the end of these episodes. The one is to ask if you have like specific recommendations, like would you point people in specific directions to get started? You mentioned Black Flag, which is, of course, that's the band where Henry Rollins comes from.
Yep.
Would they be a good point to start? Would you have other, like, kind of foundational people to get into?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it could go as deep as you like. So, yeah, sure, Black Flag. But, like, Black Flag sound like a punk band, really. They're foundational. They're, if you want to go back to the beginning, listen to Black Flag. It sounds like shit, it's scrappy and the recording's terrible. It's old school, man. It's late 70s, early 80s. But similarly, if you were to start somewhere, Minor Threat is a great place to start. But then, look at the early East Coast bands. Bad Brains are a great place to start. Again, these recordings are old, but they don't sound amazing. For more kind of mid-80s bands, Sick of It All, Cro-Mags, Agnostic Front, Madball, that sort of New York scene was absolutely huge. For more kind of 2000s bands, look at Terror, Blacklisted. For more modern bands, Turnstile, Trapped Under Ice, Internal Affairs is an oldie but a goodie. I mean, there's so many. If my favorite hardcore band of all time is probably Sick of It All, and I think they are probably one of the most popular hardcore bands. They're super accessible for someone who's just getting into it. So I would say pick up any Sick of It All record and give it a spin.
Excellent. So the closest to a pop approach.
No, I wouldn't say pop. That's a stretch. But they're definitely
more accessible. Did I already say that?
Yeah. The sonic dot that I would have joined kind of unprompted with the kind of things that I was listening to in the early stuff was the kind of focus on your own emotional state and expressing that in a way that people will get. Reminded me a lot of the Buzzcocks. That kind of like speed and aggression, but also being willing to be quite like vulnerable about the situation that you've put yourself in. The other connection that I wondered if existed was to the kind of earlier 70s punk out of places like New York. I'm thinking of people like Richard Hell, which is a lot slower and less aggressive and more cynical, but there is a real, I don't know, focus on kind of disaffection with things.
Sure. Yep. Totally get it. Look, if someone is listening right now and is like, "Oh, hardcore sounds pretty interesting. Where do I start?" Maybe if you're not into aggressive music as such. The new Turnstile record, Glow On, I think it's called. That's honestly the best technically hardcore record I've heard in years, but it does have a very pop approach. They're amazing songwriters. It's almost got like a indie rock vibe, but it is a hardcore band playing essentially what is hardcore songs at a very, very modern approach. And I have played that to people who don't even listen to hardcore whatsoever and who actually really like it. So, Turnstile.
Excellent. That's a very good place to start. The other question, of course, is what are you doing that people can find, and where can people find you, and what can they bother you to do for them, and all of those things?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, we're talking about music, so let's talk about music a bit. I play in a band called TeamSquad with my wife and another guy from Raglan. We're currently recording an EP, and so that will be out in October. We call it Retro Future Soul. It's not hardcore at all. It is drums, piano, synth, bass, and vocals. And yeah, that's about it for music. I have another band, Sonomass, which is coming out with a sort of a indie classic rock, hard rock EP coming out soon. But you can follow TeamSquad on Facebook. I think we just called TeamSquad Band. Instagram, I think we called TeamSquad Band. Pretty small. We're on Bandcamp and stuff. But October, there should be some news circulating about our EP. It's going to be awesome. For my job, I am a podcast editor. I make podcasts. I have a website called precisionpodcasting.com, and you can go and check me out if you want to make a podcast. I'd be happy to help.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you very much for talking.
Thank you for having me on. It was lots of fun chatting about hardcore. I don't get to do it often.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.